In Alcatraz, respect was currency, and once it was spent, you never got it back. October 1959, a white prisoner thought he could humiliate the most feared black man on the rock and walk away untouched. He wanted a reaction. He wanted noise. He wanted Bumpy Johnson to break, but Bumpy didn't argue. He didn't threaten. He didn't even look angry. He just kept eating, quiet, controlled, and then he smiled. 2 seconds of silence, the kind that makes a whole room feel smaller. And then, 3 seconds later, the man would never see the world the same way again. This isn't a story about rage. It's a story about patience, about strategy, and about what happens when a bully finally chooses the wrong target inside the most dangerous prison in America. This is what happened inside Alcatraz. Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary sat alone in the cold waters of San Francisco Bay, an island surrounded by freezing currents and sharp rocks, a place the federal government used when prisons failed. If a man was too violent, too influential, or too uncontrollable for the mainland, they sent him to the rock. No fences needed, no walls high enough to climb, because the water itself was the cage. Alcatraz wasn't built to fix people. It wasn't designed to rehabilitate or reform. It existed for one reason only: containment, to isolate the most dangerous prisoners in America from everyone else. Gang leaders, serial killers, men who stabbed guards, men who ran prisons from inside their cells, men whose reputations followed them wherever they went. Alcatraz wasn't about rehabilitation. It was about containment. At its peak, Alcatraz housed just over 250 inmates at a time, not because space was limited, but because control was everything. Every movement was scheduled, every meal timed, every step watched. Inmates lived in small cells with steel bars and concrete walls, no privacy, no comfort, and no illusions about freedom. This was a place designed to break influence, not bodies. Violence at Alcatraz didn't disappear. It evolved. Open fights were rare because punishment was immediate and severe. Solitary confinement, bread and water, weeks alone with nothing but your thoughts. So inmates adapted, threats became quieter, intimidation became strategic. Power was enforced through reputation, not chaos. Because in Alcatraz, the man who lost control didn't last long. This was a prison where reputations kept you alive, where being feared mattered more than being strong, where silence could protect you better than fists, and where every man was constantly measuring every other man, looking for weakness, looking for opportunity, looking for the one moment that would decide who dominated and who disappeared. Bumpy Johnson wasn't loud, he wasn't flashy, and inside prison walls he didn't need to announce who he was. By the time he arrived at Alcatraz in 1953, his reputation had already crossed the country. Harlem knew his name, federal agents knew his mind, and inmates knew one thing for certain: this was not a man you tested lightly. On the streets of Harlem, Bumpy had been more than a gangster. He was an organizer, a strategist, a man who understood numbers, people, and leverage. He read constantly, spoke carefully, and never wasted words. While others ruled through chaos, Bumpy ruled through structure. He negotiated with Italian mob families as an equal, not as muscle, but as intelligence. That carried weight inside prison too. Among black inmates, Bumpy represented something rare: dignity. He didn't beg guards. He didn't posture. He didn't allow humiliation. He listened more than he spoke. And when he did speak, people paid attention. Not because he was threatening, but because his calm suggested confidence built over decades of surviving men who tried to kill him. White inmates watched him for a different reason. They didn't see weakness in his silence. They saw calculation. They saw a man who didn't need to prove himself. Someone who understood prison politics better than most guards. Bumpy never rushed, never reacted emotionally. And in a place like Alcatraz, restraint was more unsettling than rage. By October 1959, Bumpy Johnson was 54 years old, grey, creeping into his hair, a body marked by time and prison routines. But his age worked in his favor, because experience mattered more than strength on the rock. And Bumpy had survived Harlem Wars, federal prosecutions, and 6 years inside the most unforgiving prison in America. Age hadn't weakened him. It had sharpened him. In Alcatraz, power didn't belong to the biggest man. It belonged to the one who understood timing, reputation, and consequences. Bumpy Johnson understood all three, and that understanding is why everyone noticed when he stayed silent, because silence from a man like Bumpy was never weakness. It was preparation. Eric Pollson was the kind of man Alcatraz was built to contain, physically imposing, 6'4", close to 300 pounds of hardened prison muscle. Years of weightlifting behind concrete walls had turned his body into a weapon. He moved slowly, deliberately, like someone who expected others to step aside when he passed. His crimes were not rumors or exaggerations. Court records showed 3 confirmed murders during armed robberies in Texas between 1954 and 1956. All of his victims were black men, and during his trial, Pollson made no effort to hide why. He stated openly that he targeted them because of their race. He showed no remorse, no hesitation, no awareness that his words marked him as something more dangerous than violent. They marked him as committed to hatred. Pollson's ideology wasn't emotional, it was systematic. He believed racial dominance was natural order. He believed violence was enforcement, and prison, to him, was simply another environment where that belief could be exercised. He didn't lash out randomly. He selected targets who were smaller, quieter, unprotected, and he made sure his actions stayed just below the line that would bring serious punishment. Guards tolerated Pollson because he understood rules better than most inmates. He rarely attacked when witnesses were close. He framed his harassment as accidents, bumps, spilled food, aggressive language delivered softly when authority wasn't listening, and some guards, quietly and unofficially, shared enough of his views to look the other way, not approving him publicly, but not stopping him either. Inmates feared Pollson because he combined size with history. Everyone knew what he'd done on the outside. Everyone knew he didn't regret it, and everyone understood that if he decided to escalate, the damage would be permanent. He didn't need to fight often. His reputation did most of the work for him, until the day he chose the wrong man to test. It started small, so small that most people would have dismissed it as nothing. Friday, October 16th, 1959. Lunch hour inside the Alcatraz cafeteria. Metal trays, long wooden tables, guards watching from the perimeter. Bumpy Johnson sat with 3 other black inmates eating quietly. No conversation, no drama, just another meal on the rock, until Eric Pollson walked past. Without stopping, without asking. Pollson reached down and took the dessert from Bumpy's tray. A small slice of apple pie. Standard issue. Nothing special. Except it wasn't his. Pollson kept walking, sat at his own table, and ate it slowly while staring directly at Bumpy, waiting, watching, measuring reaction. Bumpy looked at the empty space on his tray, looked at Pollson, then went back to eating. Bumpy said nothing. The men at his table stiffened, hands tightened. Everyone expected movement, words, something, but Bumpy didn't respond. No confrontation, no signal, no anger, just silence. That silence confused people. Some thought it was weakness. Others knew better. He wasn't ignoring the insult. He was recording it. He was giving him rope. The next incident came 3 days later. Monday morning. Communal showers. Steam filling the room. Concrete floors, slick with water. Dozens of inmates washing in silence. Bumpy stood under the spray when Pollson entered. Plenty of open shower heads, but Pollson walked straight toward him, shoulder lowered, timing perfect. He shoved Bumpy hard enough to make him slip. Bumpy caught himself against the wall before falling. "That's my shower," Pollson said. Low enough to avoid guards, loud enough for everyone else. A racial insult followed. Clear, deliberate, unmistakable. Bumpy straightened slowly, water dripping from his face. He looked at Pollson for several seconds, long enough to make the room uncomfortable. Then he stepped aside, moved to another shower, finished washing. Bumpy said nothing. Whispers spread immediately. Some inmates shook their heads, others stared. A shove, an insult, and still no response. But the ones who understood prison politics recognized the pattern. Pollson was growing bolder, because Bumpy was letting him. Confidence was replacing caution, and confidence makes men careless. He was giving him rope. Wednesday afternoon, October 21st, Recreation Yard. Cold air, grey sky. Inmates walking slow laps around the perimeter. Bumpy walked with 2 others when Pollson stepped directly into his path, blocked him, didn't move. "I walk straight," Pollson said. "You walk around." Another insult followed, louder this time, public, designed to humiliate. Bumpy stopped, looked at Pollson, paused just long enough for everyone nearby to watch. Then he stepped off the path, walked around him. No words, no reaction, Behind him, Pollson laughed, called after him, mocking, enjoying the moment. Bumpy said nothing. By that night the whole prison was talking. Some said Bumpy was slipping, that age had caught him, that Pollson had broken him. Others watched quietly, because they recognized something dangerous forming, a pattern, a build-up, a man being allowed to believe he was untouchable. Bumpy wasn't retreating, he was waiting, he was giving him rope. It happened the next afternoon. Thursday, October 22nd, recreation yard again, 1 hour outside, cold wind, muted conversations, most inmates killing time, waiting for the bell. Robert Jackson sat alone on a bench with a book in his hands. 23 years old, small frame, serving time for fraud, not violence, not intimidation, just a young man trying to disappear into pages until the hour ended. Pollson saw him immediately, walked over without hesitation, stood close enough to cast a shadow across the book, asked what he was reading, didn't wait for an answer, snatched the book out of Jackson's hands, mocked him for reading, mocked him for thinking, mocked him for existing. Jackson stood slowly, reached for the book, spoke politely, asked for it back. Pollson didn't argue. He swung the book across Jackson's face, hard, knocked him backward off the bench. Jackson hit the ground, hands to his face, blood at his lip. Pollson threw the book into a puddle near a drain, laughed, added words meant to crush, words meant to remind everyone watching who he thought was allowed to stand and who wasn't. Guards stepped in late, too late to prevent it, early enough to minimize consequences. Pollson received a warning, lost a single day of recreation. Jackson was sent to the infirmary, split lip, black eye, and the understanding that tomorrow would be the same, and the next day, and the one after that. This was different. This wasn't about reputation anymore. This wasn't about disrespect aimed upward. This was cruelty aimed downward. A large man choosing someone who couldn't fight back, someone who didn't belong to any group that could protect him, someone alone, and everyone in the yard knew it. That night, Bumpy Johnson sat quietly with other inmates, listened, didn't interrupt, didn't comment immediately. Then he spoke, calm, measured, certain. He said that tomorrow at lunch, Pollson would learn something he would never forget. That patience had limits, that intimidation had consequences, that size didn't equal safety when intelligence decided to act. And then Bumpy stopped talking. No threats after that. No explanation. Just silence. The kind of silence that makes men uneasy, because everyone understood. The line had been crossed, and once crossed, there was no walking back. Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary cafeteria was designed for control. Long wooden tables fixed to the floor, benches bolted down, clear sightlines from every angle. Guards posted along the walls and on raised platforms. No blind spots, no shadows. Meals were timed, movements regulated, 45 minutes in, 45 minutes out. Violence here wasn't impossible, but it was risky, and everyone knew it. On Friday, October 23, 1959, lunch began like every other day. Metal trays slid across counters. Inmates filed in by number. Bumpy Johnson took his tray and walked to his assigned table, sat down with 3 other inmates, head lowered, eating slowly, not looking around, not searching the room, just another quiet man in prison clothes. 2 minutes later, Eric Pollson entered. Same heavy steps, same confidence. But this time he didn't go to his table. He walked straight toward Bumpy's, pulled out a bench, and sat directly across from him. Uninvited, too close, deliberate. He set his tray down hard enough to draw attention. Nearby conversations slowed, eyes lifted. Something was happening. Pollson spoke loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, mocking, insulting, calling Bumpy out by reputation, by race, by history. Bumpy kept eating, didn't look up, didn't acknowledge him. That silence irritated Pollson more than shouting ever could. He leaned forward, demanded a response, insisted on respect, used words meant to provoke, meant to dominate, meant to force reaction. Then Pollson shifted his attention, turned his head toward Robert Jackson, 3 tables away. Jackson's face still bruised, still healing. Pollson called out to him, mocked him again, threatened to come over, threatened to repeat what he'd done the day before. Jackson stared at his tray, didn't move, didn't answer. Some inmates started to rise. Guards shouted for everyone to stay seated. And that's when Bumpy stood up. He rose calmly. No rush, no hesitation. In one smooth motion, his right hand moved toward his waist. What happened next took seconds. No wasted movement, no shouting. Bumpy closed the short distance between them before Pollson fully reacted. Two precise motions, executed fast, controlled, final. Pollson fell backward. Noise erupted. Guards moved instantly. Bumpy stepped back, released what was in his hand, raised his arms, didn't resist, didn't speak immediately. He allowed himself to be taken to the ground, handcuffed, removed. Only then did he say it. One sentence. Clear, cold, directed. A warning meant to last longer than any punishment. The cafeteria fell silent afterward. Not because guards demanded it, but because everyone understood what they had just witnessed. It wasn't chaos. It wasn't rage. It was conclusion. And nothing inside Alcatraz would be the same after that moment. The guards were already moving, whistles blowing, boots striking concrete, hands forcing Bumpy Johnson down, metal cuffs closing around his wrists. The room was chaos, but inside that chaos, one voice cut through everything. Low, steady, unshaken. Bumpy turned his head just enough for Pollson to hear him, just enough for the men closest to hear him. Not shouted, not emotional, spoken like a fact already decided. Touch that young brother again, call him one more name like that, and next time you won't visit a doctor, you'll visit God. Then Bumpy said nothing else. No follow-up, no explanation, no justification. He didn't repeat himself. He didn't look back. He allowed the guards to drag him away as Pollson lay broken on the cafeteria floor, hands over his face, noise replaced by fear, confidence replaced by shock. The sentence spread faster than the blood had, in whispers, in cell blocks, in yards, in places guards couldn't hear. Men repeated it quietly, because it wasn't just a threat, it was proof. Proof that patience had limits, that silence didn't mean surrender, and that some warnings only needed to be spoken once. For years afterward, inmates across federal prisons would quote that line, not loudly, not casually, but carefully, because everyone knew where it came from, and everyone knew what had happened immediately before it was spoken. Bumpy Johnson was taken straight from the cafeteria to solitary confinement. No conversation, no resistance, just procedure. A concrete cell barely large enough to stretch out. Steel door, dim light, silence meant to punish thought itself. This was standard after violence at Alcatraz. No matter who you were, no matter why it happened. Isolation first, questions later. The investigation began immediately, not quietly, not informally, but thoroughly. Prison officials interviewed guards, kitchen staff, and dozens of inmates who had witnessed the week leading up to the incident. What emerged was not a sudden explosion of violence, but a documented pattern. Food taken, physical shoves, public humiliation, repeated verbal harassment, all pointing in the same direction. Multiple witnesses described Pollson's behavior in detail, how he targeted black inmates, how he avoided guards, how he escalated slowly, how he had struck Robert Jackson the day before in full view of others. Investigators couldn't ignore the consistency. Too many stories matched. Too many details overlapped. This wasn't a single altercation. It was sustained provocation. When Bumpy gave his statement, it was brief, controlled, unemotional. He said he had defended himself and another inmate, that he had warned Pollson repeatedly through silence, that guards had failed to stop the harassment, and that when the threat became immediate and public, he acted to end it. No dramatics, no apologies, just facts. Under normal circumstances, possession of a weapon and assault inside Alcatraz meant added years, sometimes decades. But this time, that didn't happen. After 2 weeks, the administration reached a decision. Bumpy would receive 30 days in solitary confinement, punishment enough to uphold the rules, but no additional time added to his sentence. It was a quiet admission, not spoken publicly, not written plainly, but understood by everyone involved. The prison knew Pollson had been a problem. They knew complaints had been ignored. They knew their control had failed. Punishing Bumpy too harshly would mean acknowledging that failure out loud, so instead they closed the file and transferred Pollson out as soon as he recovered, ending the problem without ever saying his name. After the attack, Eric Pollson was no longer the man Alcatraz had known. Physically, he survived, but survival wasn't victory. He left the cafeteria permanently altered, quiet, withdrawn, his confidence erased in seconds. The size that once protected him meant nothing now, and everyone could see it. He stopped speaking loudly, stopped posturing, stopped testing people. The man who believed fear made him untouchable learned that fear could be taken away. More important than Pollson's change was what stopped entirely. The racial harassment ended, not gradually, not slowly, immediately. No more food taken, no more shoulder checks in the showers, no whispered insults when guards turned away. The behavior that had been tolerated for years disappeared overnight. Not because of new rules, but because the consequences had finally been made undeniable. Bumpy Johnson's status shifted permanently. Before, he was respected. Afterward, he was untouchable. Not because he threatened people, but because everyone understood what silence from him meant. No one tested it again. Younger black inmates treated him with reverence, not worship, respect, because he had protected one of their own when no one else could. And he had done it without asking for loyalty in return. White inmates changed too. Those who had watched him quietly now kept their distance, not in fear, in calculation. They understood that Bumpy wasn't emotional, wasn't reckless, wasn't impulsive, and that made him far more dangerous than men who relied on intimidation alone. Nobody wanted to be the next lesson. Even the guards behaved differently, subtle, unspoken, but noticeable. Less tolerance for harassment, more attention when Bumpy was present, not out of favoritism, but out of awareness. They understood that another failure would not end quietly, that violence had already filled the gap where authority had failed once. From that day forward, Alcatraz adjusted itself around Bumpy Johnson. No announcements, no acknowledgements, just a collective understanding. Some lines once crossed reset the balance forever, and nobody inside the rock wanted to see what happened if that balance was tested again. He didn't react when he was insulted, didn't strike when he was shoved, didn't move when he was humiliated. Each moment of restraint added weight to what would come next, because waiting wasn't weakness, it was positioning. He allowed his enemy to believe the wrong story. That silence meant fear, that patience meant surrender. By the time the truth arrived, it was already too late. This wasn't about dominance. It was about boundaries. Bumpy didn't seek conflict. He ended it, and he did so in a way that required no repetition. That clarity is why the story traveled. From cell blocks to yards, from Alcatraz to every federal prison in the country. Men repeated it not to celebrate violence, but to understand consequence. In a system that failed to protect the vulnerable, one man restored balance without speeches or movements, no slogans, no grandstanding. Just action applied at the precise moment it would matter most. That's why this story outlived everyone involved, because it carried a lesson prisons understood instinctively. Bumpy Johnson didn't win because he was stronger. He won because he waited, and in a place like Alcatraz, patience was deadlier than fists.